Hello class, welcome to our final presentation on how the Chinese economy affects the global trade. My name is Jared Lees.
And I'm Alexander Martin. Alright, and we're going to start off with a little bit of history. In 1927 started the Civil War between the Chinese Communist Party and the Republic of China. This lasted until 1937 when it paused due to the Japanese invading. So the Chinese Communist Party and the Republic of China fought together against the Japanese. The Civil War then restarted in 1945 when the Japanese were defeated and lasted until 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, took over the country. And the Republic of China fled to Taiwan. And Mao Zedong, backed by or head of the Chinese Communist Party, wanted to invade Taiwan, but they didn't really have a navy to do at the time. So they focused stuff on the mainland, like the Korean War. They backed the communist North against the capitalist South, and this made them realize something. It made them realize that the U.S. was willing to back such a small country just over capitalism versus communism, even so far away from the mainland. So they didn't, even after they had a navy after 1953, they didn't really want to invade since they knew the U.S. was going to intervene. So they worked on economic policies like all their 5-year plans. They had the first one, and then they had the Great Leap Forward, which was enacted in 1958 and was partially repealed in 1960 and fully repealed in 1961. The Great Leap Forward called for many different things, but the main things in it was the killing of wildlife and communal farming, which led to an ecological disaster, which killed millions of people. And this influenced politics and their mode of thinking. This coupled with their view of the U.S. intervening up until the future. Even though the Great Leap Forward was a pretty big disaster, it got repealed after a couple of years and didn't go through the full 5 years. This didn't really change how Mao wanted to run his economy. He kept a tight hold on it and didn't allow very much trade and no trade with capitalist nations. This started to change in 1972 when Nixon came to China and visited Mao. That's the picture is the top right. It's Mao and Nixon talking with their interpreter off to the left. And in 1976, Mao died. And after this point, some major reforms came onto the scene, major economic and social reforms. But mainly, the biggest one was trade with capitalist nations. So the U.S. was very willing to jump in here. They didn't recognize Taiwan at this point as the official China and started trading tons with China. And as you can see in that graph off to the right that I made, the trade deficit with China just grew and grew each year and almost looks exponential.
So Alec just covered a little bit of a brief history of China's economy, and before we get into more current topics about their economy, figured I'd just list off some numbers that kind of show the size of China's economy and why they're significant on the global scale. So as far in 2019, their GDP is recorded at 14.2 trillion, which is the second largest economy in the world, just behind the United States.
And when it comes to purchasing power parity, China actually did surpass the U.S. a few years ago.
And so their GDP annual growth rate for 2019 is 6%, which, as you can see on that graph to the right, it's actually slowing a little bit to where it had been in the mid to late 2000s. And their GDP per capita is just under 8,000 at 7,755, and that is from 2018. Now, their unemployment rate is very low at 3.62%, but as we'll get into later, not all their employment is compensated probably how they should. And so, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, their economic growth rate is starting to slow.
And this kind of begs the question then of how do private companies work in China? Because China on paper is a communist nation. Well, in short, they still really kind of are, but with Chinese characteristics. There is no private property, at least not in the conventional way. Everything's still owned by the Chinese government, and leases it out. And this when they lease it out, they don't entirely own it. They still have to do whatever the government tells them to do with it. It's not like here in the U.S. where you have to go through court to get a court order to do something. The local officials can basically tell somebody to do whatever they want or whatever they want to do with it, and they kind of have to comply. They'll either get fined, arrested, killed, or whatever else, depending on what local official and how big it is and so many other things. And if a company does this, they could be refused subsidies, have land confiscated, they could be outright nationalized if they're not already, or all of them above. Alright, so we kind of covered how private companies work, and highlighted China's really impressive growth. Well, this then begs the question again, how they managed to be communist but still private companies. These are through SEZs. These were first established in 1979, a year after the first trade of the capitalist nation started. And what an SEZ is a small free market area inside of a communist nation. The first one was established in Shenzhen, just northwest of Hong Kong. This still didn't allow for private ownership of anything, but it at least allowed for private markets and the invisible hand of the market to establish prices and the equilibrium of the price of a good, and it wasn't fixed to what the government said it had to be. And off to the left is Shenzhen in 1980 compared to 2011, just how fast they modernized, just how fast everything grew there. And that's just in 2011, that's not even counting for today. Shenzhen is way bigger, way more impressive than it is in that picture. Alright, so then moves on to what all the wealthy individuals and all the wealthy companies in China did with all this money. Well, a ton of this money was saved in real estate, since real estate is more secure than the banking system is in China, at least on a grand scale, since even though it could be seized by the government, it gave more long-term stability, not so dependent on the currency of China and not so dependent on the laws and regulations at that time. And this led to a massive demand of construction, and just kept going and going and going, as that picture in Shenzhen showed. It just kept building and building over time. But the demand got so low over time, and there's so many construction companies that the ghost city started to appear. Like in this picture off the right, it's a city meant for thousands of people, but only house a few hundred or maybe a couple thousand at most. And this is done for two reasons. Now, I talked about savers earlier, but this is also done because of overzealous investors. The demand is there for the suppliers, but the demand isn't there for the buyers. There's no one buying these properties. There's no one renting the properties. There's only people paying for the construction. But this may lead into another boom as people move out to these new cities, as China's population continues to grow as slowly as it is now. But so the Chinese government recognized this, and they started to export some of this building to places that need it. So there's a few different ways how this gets exported. One way is either investors or savers go to a different country to buy a property, and this is either to save, to invest, or to just evade Chinese taxes. And another reason is just to get your eggs out of one basket, because don't want to have all your property in China. If something happens in China, then you're gonna have a really big issue. But if you have something in China, Australia, and the U.S., you're a lot more risk averse. But there's been a kind of negative thing that has happened about this is, country has been most heavily impacted by this is Australia. They've had sharp increases of property prices since a wealthy investor would come in and just buy a property outright without getting a loan, and this is happening quite often, or at least often for what it is, which artificially inflates the prices in Australia, making it harder for Australian citizens to buy property. And then there's another way China export this. With the other way, they had the buyers of the property, the people who are investing and saving their money and putting their money up front for the properties. Well, the Chinese construction companies still need pay. They still need to stay in business. So the Chinese government has done the Belt and Road. This is $1 trillion global infrastructure investment. This would make China the center of global trade, since the U.S. kind of is right now, with ports on the Atlantic and the Pacific. Everything, a lot of stuff comes through the U.S. China wants to become that of Asia. And it's just another reason why it's not only to top the U.S., but it's to get pushed past the middle income trap, which is when a nation is more rich than a developing nation and doesn't have cheap labor to exploit, but isn't so rich that they're a developed nation, and they're kind of stuck in this weird limbo where they stop growing, but they don't really fall backwards, and they're not very rich, but not very poor. And this kind of was covered in the earlier slide with their economy starting to slow down. It was 14%, a decade ago, but now it's just 6%, which is still a lot. But at the rate they're slowing, it's going to slow down to U.S. levels of growth in the next decade or so. And a big pro of this is underdeveloped nations get massive loans to pay for big infrastructure projects, whether they need it or not, do ports, new airports, new runways and roadways and things like that. However, this has kind of led to a double-edged sword, because they get these new infrastructure projects built, but they're caught into a debt trap. And in a lot of these cases, China has just come in and said, we'll forgive your loan. We just want a 99-year lease of this property. And this has happened to several different countries, including Maldives, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Montenegro. And in Sri Lanka, there was a large deep water port that was made, and due to their civil war, they couldn't pay for it. So China came in and made a naval base out of it. And a stipulation that's also kind of a negative, could be a positive because it might be cheaper, but a negative is Chinese companies are the ones that are being used for this. It's written into the contracts of these loans that you have to use Chinese agencies, Chinese construction firms to do these projects. And some of them are China State Construction Company, Huawei, China Overseas Property, and there are many, many others. And this has caused, some resentment by some of the poorer countries and some even developed nations who see this as, China stepping onto their turf, with Chinese, but American and UK and France firms that could be doing this as well, but China's coming in doing it, and they feel like this is unfair. So they've been complaining to the IMF and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and there have been suits over it, but nothing's really been concretely made out about it.
So I'm sure most of you are familiar with sweatshops, as it's sort of a very, very controversial topic in China and other nations across the world. And for China in particular, there are certain pros and cons that can come along with this. So sweatshops give China a competitive advantage in cheaply producing many textile products. Obviously, there's ethical issues that come along with this and stuff, but at the end of the day, sweatshops allow for really cheap labor, which allows them to compete on a global level in textile production. It also allows for many unemployed people to obtain employment, even if it's in poor working conditions and for a very low wage. Obviously, China has a very, very massive population, and so there's a lot of people that, if there weren't sweatshops, probably wouldn't have any other work. It also can provide workers with some experience who've never had a job before. I guess you could see it as entry-level work. And some of the cons are that working and living conditions for the workers are very poor. That's probably some of the stuff that you've you've seen in the news before with Foxconn and some other companies like that. That workers are just in really tight confined spaces, and there's issues with high rates of worker suicide and things of that nature. And then yes, also other than the working conditions being very poor, it's also not for a whole lot of money, but as I mentioned earlier, it still is a little bit of income that can help people get by.
And on top of that, with purchasing power changing over countries, $70 a week to someone in a poorer country with lower purchasing power or more purchasing power, $70 might be equivalent to, $500 or something like that.
So not only do sweatshops have a significant impact on China individually, but it also has an effect on the global scale. So as far as countries doing business in China and investing in China, the poor working conditions that workers have and their treatment causes ethical dilemmas both for businesses and consumers. This happens on a consumer level because, as I mentioned before, it's in the news and people are aware of it at this point in time. So a lot of people, when they see products that are made in China, they might just assume that it was made in a sweatshop and that they don't want to support that type of production. So it's a dilemma for consumers, and then for businesses even more so, as their investments and their money are the ones that are responsible for this kind of treatment for workers. But there also are some pros that can go along with it. The cheaper labor provided by sweatshops drive prices down for products. So I mean, that's just simple economics, really. I mean, the cheaper labor results in cheaper production prices, which can make it so you can sell products for less, which that can benefit businesses and consumers. And the poor treatment of workers also comes into effect with extended hours and lots of overtime. And so while this is bad for the workers and the people who are having to put in all those hours, it also allows for products to be produced much faster than they would in places that have more labor laws like the United States or others.
And it also, as I brought up in a previous slide, people or companies countries have complained about China's unfair use of their state-owned corporations. In this case, you have companies that would complain about unfair competition and would complain to supranational organizations or to countries trying to lobby and get more power, and it just leads to resentment even among firms in the global scale. And as I brought up earlier with the middle income trap, China has moved into that area where they're not quite a developing nation, but they're not quite 100% a first world nation either. They're really close. So they've got into that middle income trap where they've lost their competitive advantage of the cheap labor, but not quite the sophisticated, super high level production that developed nations have, like the France, the UK, or Japan, or the US have.
And so other things that have contributed towards China slowly moving away from sweatshops, but not quite there yet, are technological improvements in the manufacturing process, making those more automated, which obviously replaces the need for workers in some situations. So less and less people are needed for the manufacturing process due to technological improvements. So that's a factor in China transitioning away from sweatshops. Many countries have also started moving, or many companies have also started moving manufacturing to other countries like Vietnam, because they have even cheaper labor costs than China, because China started to develop a few more labor laws and higher minimum wage in recent years. But it's not on the whole basis of the country as a whole. It's in individual counties that they raise minimum wage laws, and it's not on a federal level. So there'll probably still be some sweatshops that exist in China until it's changed on a more countrywide basis.
And moving off from all the products that are made in sweatshops and all the other manufacturing plants and things like that, a lot of them go through the South China Sea. This is one of the biggest trading lanes in the entire world, with $5.3 trillion of trade going through the South China Sea each year. And China claims this entire sea, which causes disputes with many nations in the area, including Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Taiwan, and other countries. A way that they've been pushing their claims is with the establishment of military bases on artificial islands to regulate the area and push their power and influence out. As a response to this, the U.S. has had freedom of navigation exercises to get close to these islands with Navy ships and to go through claimed area as if it were international waters, just to show China that they don't claim this land, or they don't own this land. This causes some issues in the area with uncertainty of a fight breaking out, or I forgot to mention it, there's also China has been hiring, the Chinese Navy has been hiring local fishermen around Vietnam and Philippines and Taiwan to mess with their navies to discourage them from going to those areas. And coupled with the U.S. and China being in this area and China paying these fishermen to do this, has caused more uncertainty and caused it to be more of a liability for companies to move product through this area. So there's been talks about redistribution throughout the world and moving, transporting of goods to different trading lanes or different countries of origin or different countries at the end. And kind of how this all ties together is, companies in more democratic nations like the U.S. are very heavily invested in China. A good example of this is Hollywood. They've been making movies more for China than they have for the U.S. since the Chinese market is bigger. And there are companies in China that operate in democratic nations. This includes things like Huawei, who are technically private but have a lot of government influence and will divulge any information or data if the Chinese government wants it. This caused kind of a more of a national risk to use Chinese companies in other democratic nations. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, this influences and affects companies and countries and third world nations, but it does affect first world nations as well, even countries in the G7, which is the 7 biggest economies in the world, most notably being Italy, which in this COVID-19 pandemic was the most impacted country in the G7 aside from China. And this also, having such a focus on China and having so many eggs in one basket, causes a disruption in global supply chains whenever something wrong happens. This has been very notable with COVID-19, since companies have so many manufacturing plants and resource extraction set up in China. As soon as this happened, that manufacturing stopped, goods stopped flowing all over the world. I mean, just look at what happened with ventilators. Ventilators basically went to zero all over the world because most of them were produced in China.
So these are all the sources that we used, and this concludes our presentation.
It was fun to make this, and we are looking forward to watch everybody else's presentation. I hope everyone has a great summer.